Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Spicing Up Your Kitchen program. Cornell University Cooperative Extension of Nassau County is here. Thank you, Khy, and take it away.
Thank you, Debbie. Again, thank you, everybody who's joining us with Oceanside Library tonight. My name is Khy Ee. I'm a community nutrition educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension. So essentially what I do is I teach nutrition to senior centers all over Nassau County. And we do topics ranging from heart health to diabetes to just basic healthy eating one-on-one. And so for tonight, especially, we're going to focus on spicing up your kitchen. So we're going to touch a bit on sodium, heart health, and sort of healthy alternatives for salt intake. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write it in the chat and I could answer them towards the end of our discussion. Okay. So first off, we're going to sort of establish a definition for sodium. And the reason why sodium is so important is because it's essentially very essential for life. It's important for fluid balance, nerve impulses, and maintaining muscle function. But why is it that everybody is hesitant on salt intake? Well, there's something big that happens when we have excess sodium in our bodies, and it's a couple things. First thing to note is that wherever sodium is in your body, water is going to follow. So what I mean by that essentially is sodium tends to attract water. And so in doing so, it pulls water into your blood vessels and thereby increasing the amount of blood that is in your blood vessels. So think of this analogy to sort of help out this explanation here. Just picture sort of like a narrow stream of water. Under normal circumstances, that stream is going to flow very smoothly with no disruptions. But let's say there's some sort of flash flood or major disruption. And then ultimately what happens to that narrow stream is that the water is going to build up and create increased pressure on the stream. And that's sort of what our blood vessels look like when we have an increased amount of blood volume in our blood vessels, hence why it's called high blood pressure. And so with high blood pressure, the reason why we want to be mindful of it is because it's associated with chronic conditions like increased risk of heart failure, heart attacks. And it's also associated with increased risk of stroke as well. And the reason why is because if you have increased blood pressure, it's going to ultimately affect the organs that the blood is flowing to. So let's say the blood vessels flowing to your brain is affected, then that increases your risk of stroke, and vice versa with the heart and kidneys. Are there any questions so far with sodium and the explanation of high blood pressure? Okay. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write it in the chat. And also, you might hear high blood pressure referred to as hypertension. They are both the same thing. Okay, so we have an idea that sodium is essential for life. Excess sodium is something that we don't really want to encourage. So where can sodium be found in our diet specifically? Well, sodium is found in a lot of foods like table salt, as most of us might know. However, in fact, most of our sodium intake actually comes from processed or preserved foods. In fact, 80% of our sodium intake comes from processed foods. So although it's very important to be mindful of the salt shaker, we want to also be mindful of where our food is coming from. Is it processed? Is it canned? Or is it preserved? That's something we definitely want to keep in mind. And so the diagram I have on your left here is published by the American Heart Association. And it's called the Salty Six because they create a list of the foods that are most high in sodium. And so I'm going to go through each one very briefly. So breads and rolls, it might be surprising to some of you that it's actually high in sodium, and that's because salt is used in the baking process. Of course, it creates that lovely taste that we all love in bread, but it's also actually used as a preservative for bread dough, and it really helps to strengthen the gluten strands in bread. So thereby making sure that it gets like that nice rise that we like to see in bread. So it is an essential ingredient in breads and rolls, but it's also something to keep in mind, especially if you're trying to watch your sodium intake. Now with pizza, it's sort of like a similar example to bread. Obviously, the pizza dough will have some salt added to that dough making process. And there's also salt in the sauces as well. And if there's any sort of toppings like pepperoni or other canned meats, that's going to have a bit of sodium in there as well. Hence why pizza is on the salty 6 list. And again, with sandwiches, of course, you're going to get sodium from any luncheon meats or bread and condiments as well, which we're going to get into a little bit later. Same thing with cold cuts and cured meats. Of course, because salt is being used as preservative, those types of foods are going to be high in sodium, very expected. Something I actually do want to point out is a lot of us really like to drink soup, especially because it's getting a bit colder and it's just nice to have something hot. But it's important to note that a lot of places, especially in outside restaurants, use a lot of salt in their foods. So just keep in mind when you go out to a restaurant, you could look for low sodium options. A lot of the restaurants will have little heart icons that indicate that that item is sort of reduced sodium. So just also look out for that as well if you're trying to drink soup. And again, burritos and tacos, sort of the same principle. So I also want to touch on the fact that the American Heart Association recommends us to have about 2,300 milligrams of sodium every day as the limit. And so what does that equate to in terms of how much sodium we add into our diet? Well, in fact, it's actually not that much. 2,300 milligrams, while it sounds like a lot, it only includes about 1 teaspoon of salt. So what does 1 teaspoon of salt look like? Well, it looks like if everyone would just take out their hands, and if you see that little nub on your second finger right here, that is about the size of 1 teaspoon. So imagine that the American Heart Association is recommending that we limit our salt intake to 1 teaspoon a day. It's definitely a bit eye-opening in that sense, and most Americans consume about 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day. So definitely an interesting statistic, but of course we have to remember that most of our sodium intake comes from these salty 6 processed foods. Okay. So in addition to the salty 6, a lot of them, as you might have noticed, includes salty sauces, dips, and condiments, just like the pizza, in the pizzas, in the sandwiches. And it's true that sauces and condiments are a hidden source of calories, fat, sodium, and sugar. So if you know someone in your family that may be underweight or is trying to gain weight, sauces and dips can be a great way to incorporate more calories into their diet. But if you're someone, or if you know someone in your family that's trying to watch their salt intake, it's a little bit of a different story. And so the key here is to sort of be mindful of our portion sizes when using our sauces and dips, and also just being aware of how much sodium truly is in those types of foods. So in the table below, I have a couple of examples of popular sauces like mayo, ranch, barbecue sauce, and soy sauce. And you can see, of course, their calorie, their fat values, but if you go all the way to the right, that's where the sodium values are. So you'll see mayo has 90 milligrams of sodium and vice versa. Now we have to remember that the American Heart Association recommendation was only about 2,300 milligrams a day of sodium. So let's say I had a serving of soy sauce. That already equates to almost half of my daily allowance of sodium every day. So as you can see, some condiments are much higher in sodium versus others. So we have to sort of choose how much sodium we want to use and which ones we want to use on occasion. Does anybody have any questions so far? I know we've reviewed a lot so far. Okay, all righty, let's move on then. Oh, and I just want to quickly point out the reason why soy sauce is especially high in sodium. It's not surprising, again, because the way soy sauce is made is because the soybeans are being fermented. And so, of course, with any fermentation process, it's going to require a lot of salt. Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, that's a great question. So Markin Carey asked, what serving size are you using in this chart? So for sauces, I always use a 1 tablespoon of sauce. So this reflects the nutrition facts for 1 tablespoon for the following condiments. Thank you for clarifying. Okay. Great. So we sort of reviewed the salty 6 here, where we can find like the most popular foods high in sodium and also condiments as well. So we're going to talk about now sort of like less saltier alternatives, because we still want to make sure that our food is really flavorful, right? That's the fun of eating, but we also want to make sure that we're not having too much added salt or sodium. So here's some, I guess, examples of what you can put instead of salt in your foods. So one example, it's actually one of my favorites, is using plain Greek yogurt. And although some of us might think that Greek yogurt is only used in sweet circumstances, it's actually really great to replace sour cream with Greek yogurt. And so I love to just make tzatziki with Greek yogurt. You can add lime juice and some dill, and it really makes a great spread. You can also use it in corn salads. Instead of using mayo, I've used Greek yogurt and added some corn, onions, and pepper, and it's really gotten a nice creamy texture with it. So highly recommend Greek yogurt, and it's also high in protein as well, so there's an added bonus there. Oh, I see a question from Darla, who asked, are fermented foods high in sodium? So yes, they are high in sodium, just because, again, it's similar to sort of how we talked about the bread having salt in it, because it's required in that baking process to be used as a preservative in order to help bread rise. Fermented foods require sodium in order to draw out the water from the foods that it's being added to. So let me try to think of an example. Oh, so for instance, let's say we're using cabbage as an example in order to make kimchi. So we're going to want to add a lot of salt to it to draw out most of the water from it, and so that we can add spices and other things that the cabbage can absorb. So yeah, sodium is a great ingredient to draw out water, and it's also a great ingredient to help bread rise. So for those reasons, bread and fermented foods are high in sodium. So it's just something to be mindful of as well. Okay, so we're going to move back to our less salt alternatives. And nutritional yeast is a second option. This is a great option, especially if you know someone who is a vegetarian or a vegan based. Nutritional yeast, if you're not familiar with it, it looks like a ground yellow powder, and it's mainly used as a substitute for cheese. So you can add nutritional yeast to pasta and make like a vegan mac and cheese. Those are the most sort of common uses for it. But people also use nutritional yeast as sort of like a seasoning powder. You can add it to salads. You can add it to grain bowls for a little extra flavor. So definitely give it a try if you haven't already, especially if you know someone who's a plant-based diet. Now with olive oil or avocado oil, that's a great way of sort of making sure that you're still getting some healthy fats, but also it gives a nice well-rounded flavor to a lot of recipes. And actually the recipe I'll share with you guys later uses olive oil. So I'll get more into that later. Herbs and spices are probably the number one way or number one alternative that you can use instead of salt. Now, herbs and spices vary from savory to sweet, and there's really a lot of flexibility with them as well. So big fan of those. And of course, with herbs and spices, acidity also goes hand in hand with it and helps bring balance to the foods. So using lemon or lime juice is another great way of adding more flavor to food without packing on the salt. And just like herbs and spices sort of bring out the best in the foods that we cook with, using any sweeteners like honey or maple syrup is another great way of getting a new different flavor profile from these savory foods. Okay, and on the right here are sort of other alternatives you can try: avocado for creaminess, vinegar, again, to bring out a different profile. Mustard is great, especially if you're trying to get, they're great to mix with herbs and spices, which I'm a big fan of. And nut butters, again, for creaminess as well, is another great alternative. Okay. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into herbs and spices. So I've just listed some popular herbs that I'm sure we're all familiar with, like cinnamon is from tree bark, ginger is a root, saffron, nutmeg, cloves, and vanilla. And you'll note that a lot of these are actually fall-themed spices. So now is a great time to try to sort of mix up your cooking and sort of make your own spice blend, especially with all the fall harvest vegetables that are in season right now. And herbs are especially great as well because they're high in antioxidants, which is great for reducing free radicals in our body. And free radicals, just to create a baseline, is something that's associated with a lot of chronic conditions. So therefore, we just want to make sure that having herbs and spices has that antioxidant benefit. And it can also prevent free radical formation as well in some articles. Okay. All right. Oh, and these are some more spices as well. Like this is more so something I like to use, especially with poultry. So anything with cayenne, garlic, and ginger, I love to use with my meats. This slide was more for the sweet route. This one incorporates a bit more leaves like oregano, which I love using again with my meats, especially chicken. And again, all of these have some sort of antioxidant benefits, which is great for reducing free radicals, which is associated with chronic conditions like cancer and heart conditions. Okay, so we sort of had a cumulative list of all these spices that you could work with instead of using salt, and I hope this gave you some inspiration. So here's actually some ideas that apply sort of the herbs and spices list that we just reviewed. So popular sauces like chimichurri uses parsley, oregano, garlic, and lots of oil. So they're most commonly used with meats, like especially steak. I've also used chimichurri on fish too, and I think it tasted great in that as well. So it doesn't only have to be in meats. Pestos, again, they're really flexible. They're great for, I love having it with grains like bread and pasta. And I love it especially because they have pine nuts, so it gives that nice nutty flavor. And you don't really have to add salt to pesto, especially if you're going to be using Parmesan cheese. It's important to note that while we should be mindful of processed foods that have sort of high levels of sodium, a lot of foods are also naturally high in sodium. Like meat is naturally high in sodium. Cheeses may have some sodium to it. So it's just important to be mindful of the foods we eat, how much sodium is naturally in it versus what's added to it. Any questions so far? Okay, good. And again, green chutney If you're a fan of cilantro, this one's for you. Garlic, ginger, cilantro, lemon juice, and especially chilies is another great way to incorporate spices and really sort of elevate the foods that you're eating. If you're not a fan of spices as well, I know a lot of people maybe have trouble eating them in the first place, then it's great to just stick to the herbs and the acidity part of what we talked about. Okay. Again, a little bit more ideas. If you have someone in your family that's vegan or loves to go just plant-based with their recipes, you can do a vegan pesto that's also nut-free by using nutritional yeast like we talked about. And that sort of gives it a bit more of a cheesy, richer flavor. And you can even make a vegan vodka sauce with nuts as well, with some cashews, olive oil, onion, garlic, and tomatoes. So very, very similar to the vodka sauce we're all familiar with, except it's made with some cashews, which offer that nice creaminess to the vodka sauce. Okay, so Mark and Carrie asked if this PowerPoint will be available for downloading. So I could send a PDF to everybody at the end of our discussion. So what you can do for me in the meantime is that you can leave your email in the chat and I can send a PDF version of this PowerPoint directly to you. So you guys can refer to it at home in case you needed some recipe inspiration. So again, just leave your emails in the chat and I'll write it down and I'll send it to you once our class is done. Okay, so that sort of covers the nutrition discussion of what we have today. I do want to share a recipe that I made to show you guys on camera today. So we did sort of discuss sweet and savory fall spices, but I sort of really want to bring it home by offering like a suggested spice mix. So none of this is probably too new to you guys. Using cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, and cloves is the ultimate sweet fall spice combination. This recipe is adapted from a website called Spoon University, but I tinkered a bit with the ratios just because I find that having a little bit more nutmeg and a little bit more ginger sort of makes the recipes more flavorful in my opinion. But again, you can use this as inspiration and tinker the ratio on your own at home. And ground cloves, I will say, is an underdog. They are great for complementing cinnamon. Okay, so savory spices is a bit more of an extensive list. Essentially, I just included dried oregano leaves, sage, thyme, rosemary, and lots of ground black pepper. It's optional if you want to include ground ginger. But I would say if you don't have it in your pantry, don't stress about it. But if you want to try it, definitely give it a go. I included it in the sweet fall spices, but with savory, it's also really good as well. So I would recommend that. Yeah, this is also adapted from spoonuniversity.com. But again, I tinkered with the ratios of the black pepper and the dried oregano leaves. And you'll note that if you have poultry seasoning at home, which is like a preset combination made by McCormick, they include pretty much all the ingredients listed here, like thyme, rosemary, marjoram, and sage. So if you feel like the spices maybe are a bit too pricey in the supermarket, which I can definitely see that happening. Or if you feel like you're just not going to use all those spices in time, just buy the preset combination like poultry seasoning, and it will have a majority of these savory fall spices. So that's a great tip for saving some money. That's a good question. So Mark and Carrie asked how much fresh ginger is equivalent to powdered ground ginger. So to be honest, I do not know the exact ratio, just because with powdered products, you have to imagine like they're a more concentrated version of their fresh counterpart. So I don't have a specific answer. I'm sorry for that. But I think if you do want to use fresh ginger in cooking, then I would essentially like cut off like a little knob of the ginger and just cook it with whatever I'm making. Like let's say I'm making chicken, I'll just throw a knob of ginger with the chicken, and then I'll take out that knob once that chicken's done cooking. So one of my patrons isn't eating the ginger knob. So that's what I would do. And just to give you context, I'm only suggesting about a teaspoon of ground ginger in both spice combinations. So I would say it would definitely take a lot of fresh ginger to make the equivalent of 1 teaspoon of that ground ginger. Definitely use it sparingly. We only want like a hint of the ground ginger flavor, not like a strong flavor, unless that's something you like. So yeah, I'm sorry it's not the most direct answer, but I hope it sort of helped. All right, so this is the last thing I want to share with you guys. It's a fall roasted butternut squash recipe. Again, very, very simple. With Thanksgiving coming up, this is something you can definitely think about including in your Thanksgiving spread. So I used about 4 cups of butternut squash, diced and peeled. If you're worried about cutting the entire squash, you can buy it diced and peeled in Stop and Shop, and they make it very easy for you. And I also used about 2 tablespoons of olive oil, so just a generous drizzle of it. And I placed it on a baking sheet with parchment paper, spray nonstick spray, and then I threw in the butternut squash with the following seasonings. Like I mentioned, it's much more affordable to have the poultry seasoning instead of buying individual spices. If you're worried like you won't use all the spices in time. So again, I used poultry seasoning that has thyme, sage, rosemary, marjoram, and I know I'm forgetting one thing. What am I forgetting? Oh, the oregano. And I actually added a little bit more dried oregano, ground pepper, and chili powder to sort of enhance the recipe. And an option you can do is adding a little bit of cinnamon as well. Cinnamon and squash and sweet potatoes go hand in hand, whether you go the sweet or savory route with the vegetables. So I would definitely recommend trying cinnamon on your butternut squash if you are up for it. And I actually made it. So I wanted to show you guys what it looked like. So this is about 2 cups of butternut squash that I have in my tray, and I cooked it. I preheated the oven on the bake setting at 400 degrees, and I baked it for 20 minutes so that they become nice and slightly soft, and just cooked all the way through. And then for the last 5 minutes, after the 20 minutes up, I switched the oven setting to broil, and I just let it sit there for 5 minutes so it gets a little bit brown and crisp on the edges. And that's how you make a very easy fall roasted butternut squash recipe. And if you really want to make it fancy, you can add pumpkin seeds, you can add Brussels sprouts, another vegetable on here, and really just go ham with this recipe. But this is sort of like the down to basics so that you guys can include your own customizations to this recipe. Now, are there any more questions with regarding to what we talked about today or the recipe itself? Okay. I'm gonna just quickly stop my share so I can have the chat in a bigger space. Okay, I see Mark and Carrie, you wrote down your email, so I'm just gonna note that down now, and I can send you this PDF version of the PowerPoint. Okay, if anybody else wants to have a PDF version of this PowerPoint, please leave your email in the chat box and I'll note it down and send it to you as soon as we're done here. Oh yeah, no problem. Thank you guys again for attending today's class. I really appreciate your time in joining me with Oceanside Library. And if you really like this program, definitely let your librarians know and spread the word to your other friends. So the next time we have this program, we can have more people as well. Okay, if you guys don't have any more questions, feel free to leave. I'll be here for another about 2 minutes to answer any lingering questions.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Khy Ee. That was a great program.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Debbie, for hosting.
No problem. And I will turn off the recording now.
Yes. Thank you, Dara. Definitely try it at home. I'm sure you guys have made sweet potatoes before. Butternut squash is no different.